Welcome to episode 2 of the Somatic Enneagram podcast. When we began to plan for this podcast, it was our hope that you would get to hear real conversations about somatic work.
And who better to join us for those conversations than Marion Gilbert, a seasoned Enneagram teacher, as well as a brilliant body worker and physical therapist.
Marion's emphasis on awakening through embodied integration has resonated deeply with us both. It's what drew us to her unique approach and transformative teachings in the first place.
In this episode, we'll hear about Marion's personal journey from curiosity to spiritual experiences, some of the most influential teachers she's had, and how she began to recognize the intersection between somatic awareness and the Enneagram, and how it contributes to true healing.
That sounds great. Here's episode 2.
Welcome back to the Somatic Enneagram podcast. And in this next series of episodes, we're going to be talking with Marion Gilbert. She has been working with the Enneagram for the last 20 years and with the body as a physical therapist for a couple of decades before that. And she has extensive training and experience in a number of healing modalities, craniosacral, trauma resolution, and so much more that we're going to get into. But her emphasis is on developing somatic awakening through embodied integration. And this is what we've been so drawn to her for, and we have her here today to tell us more about herself.
Yes, and we've both worked really closely with her and found her to be someone who is both teaching and embodying something very unique. And so her own experiences of awakening and her journey to get where she's at by teaching her somatic awareness method in conjunction with the somatic Enneagram has been really inspiring to us. And so we're excited to bring her voice to you in this way.
So welcome. We're really, really happy to have you here for these conversations. And we have a lot of questions and excited for the stories you're going to share. But I wanted to start with one of the biggest questions that comes up from people who have been exposed to your work or who've heard of you. And that is, will you start by pronouncing your name for us?
Oh, I love that one because I usually say, you can call me anything, I'll listen to it. Because it's not an easy pronunciation. Here the word itself would be pronounced Marion. And where I come from, it is Marion. So Marion is a different stress on the different syllable, and as well as, it being more of a French pronunciation, which is the French version of Mary.
Mm-hmm. So you're not going to get upset whatever we call you.
No, because I know it's not easy to.
In a small group setting, I feel like if there are 10 people, they all call you something different.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a name, know, and I'm not so attached to it, although, I am being accustomed to responding to that name.
Yeah,
so that's how I see it.
That's great. So you've traveled all over the world, both personally and professionally, and you've had the opportunity to experience different kinds of spiritual teaching. So let me start with, what led you to seek those things out, and how have those spiritual experiences impacted you?
I've always had a spiritual inclination, even as a child. I remember not really growing up in a religious family. But we're taught to say evening prayers and prayers before meals and after meals. And I always took to them in a way that my mother told me that I was the only one that would spontaneously started praying. Not necessarily saying the little prayer that little kids say, but having something that came after it. And I would, wake up in the middle of the night and, as a kid feeling afraid of the dark, and then, having the courage to go and look behind the curtain and then to see the stars. And I
Hmm.
always got affected by that and calmed down by it. And, so I've had that inclination my whole life. And then I remember as a teenager, I would enter into conversations with people that in my culture would be Christian based, and, having intense discussions about how come that some people that never heard of Christianity cannot be saved. That didn't
Hmm.
make sense to me, So we had all these conversations that always perked my interest. Even as a kid, when I had a bracelet with these little bangles on them, these little figurines, I picked out a Buddha statue without knowing it was a Buddha. And I wanted that. And my mother tried to talk me out of it. And no, I want that one. I mean, little anecdotal things that made me later on, say like, oh, how interesting, because I ended up in my life being interested in humans and how we live on this planet, and where animosity and war and famine, and how come all this stuff is happening here. I always had a very keen interest in wanting to know more about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So from there, I just went to high school and physical therapy school, and in the psychology class, there was, a certain subject you had to choose in order for you to kind of complete the class as part of the training. And I remember choosing anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner. And I didn't know anything about it, but I was drawn to it because of the practical applications like biodynamic farming, and
Mm-hmm.
we call it the free school. Here we call it the Waldorf school. And then, I was interested in the eurythmy and some of the teachings. I said, there's something happening here that I feel attracted to. So I read about it, and I did something in relationship to, writing up something that was way over my head and too complex. And yet I was very happy I made that at least, some form of study. And then at the end, when I graduated, we had parties, and I kept asking all my professors. I said, I am now supposed to have a diploma to become a physical therapist. And yet, in the whole 4 years of school, I haven't heard anything about what healing is.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody has even asked the question, nor was it explained. What is healing, and what are the
Yeah.
obstacles to healing?
Yeah.
And I would drove my professors nuts with these questions because they couldn't answer it.
Yeah, it is such a deeper thing than just doing the work of physical therapy to ask the question of healing. And I think sometimes in our own work, like, are we asking the question, like, how are we healing ourselves or being with ourselves? So
Yeah.
yeah, the healing question is such a deeper question.
Yeah, and it has continued through the 40 years or 45 years now that I've been a physical therapist this year. Has continued to give me so much insight in myself and the healing process, how miraculous it is, and how we are in our own way of healing ourselves.
Hmm. Mm,
And that the obstacles to healing are the same as the obstacles to spiritual
mm,
experience. There's
mm,
not one hair of difference in it. And when I started to understand that at the end of my training, that same psychology teacher we had a party at his house, and we went there, and they were talking about this particular person that he had been with. And they started to talk about this person, and my ears were perking up.
mm,
And I said, who are you talking to? Who are you talking about? And that ended up being J. Krishnamurti, which is an amazing human who denounced all the spiritual attachments that other people gave him and became what he called a world teacher. And basically was giving lectures about what spirituality is and what it isn't. And mixed with psychology, mixed with biology, mixed with already talking about the energetic states that human beings have access to and can't get to because of A, B, C, and D. And he put himself on a little wooden chair at the same level as us. And that was really helpful for me to see, really helpful. And I was profoundly impacted when I went to England, to Brockwood, and later on to Ojai in Southern California, where he had his centers. And at the same time, I had already been in Sweden and studied at the Rudolf Steiner University or college there, and lived in a family, in a Swedish family where both parents, one was studying eurythmy and the other one was a biodynamic teacher at the regular university. And I was taking care of the 4 kids. And that's where I went to their library and I picked up Autobiography of a Yogi and read it from cover to cover. And I was interested in traveling, to the north, the south, the east, the west, and I wanted to experience all the differences. Yeah.
So what I'm really hearing as you're talking about that is the dual interest in the practicality. How does this really work? And then this breadth and spiritual curiosity that led you to picking up different books and going more deeply with different teachers like Krishnamurti. And I'm curious how you see your Enneagram pattern in how you've gotten to the place that you're at now, like as the path that you've been on spiritually and practically in your career.
Well, my Enneagram type is type 8 that I lead with, and I definitely was from the get-go a truth seeker. It was about truth for me, and also it was about a love that went beyond the human sentimental love that I had experienced when I also went to some kind of satsang, and it was all heart-based, and my heart just burst open at that time, and I went into a spiritual state for several months that I can still recall as I'm sitting here. That was so incredibly other than what I normally experienced, and it lasted for a very long time. And it didn't really go away until I had my first inkling of, if I take one more breath into this, I'm going to dissolve in a million pieces. And that slowly began to contract the field. Yeah. So it was very interesting how we have certain capacities. That is what became clear to me. The capacity in the body in order to transmit and a spiritual experience requires a certain capacity of the neurobiological energetic system. And that's what was being taught to me then. It's like, oh, I just hit a boundary and I couldn't go beyond it. Yeah. And mostly that came from my head. Yeah. So that idea that if I breathe one more breath into this, I'm going to dissolve into a million pieces. I mean, it is a boundary that I experienced that made me believe that I could not continue to go into the breathing into that state. And that's how I knew that the overwhelm that we talk about now in the somatic Enneagram has something to do on both sides, both on, the spiritual awareness side, as well as the contracted, protective, defensive, instinctual side. Yeah. that are both, having a boundary in how much this conduit, this physical conduit, can conduct through one time unit. Yeah.
Right. And I hear that practical limitation and how important it is. And as someone who's studied the body and is prone to being curious about the body, to acknowledge that. So it's not just a airy-fairy idea of transcendence or I'll just become one with the universe, without acknowledging and honoring the capacity, the boundary of the body.
The boundary, the necessary boundary of the body, but also the enormous potential of being a receptacle. That goes beyond our current understanding of how far that reaches, right? Unless you have completely, transcended that in your physical body. And I'm convinced that we have to take ourselves with us in the enlightened states.
I love the idea of capacity. How much do you feel like, as an 8 who is in the body center, do you feel like you have more natural capacity than, say, somebody that's in the head center or the heart center?
Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because, how do you quantify, the sea you swim in, right? However, I do believe that the 8 pattern is set up to accumulate chi, energy.
Mm-hmm.
It does things by accumulation of the wellspring. So I believe the structure itself is predisposition to creating greater capacity in the nervous system, because we have to deal with a lot. So that can work for us, but it can also work against us. If you push the envelope and if you push the river, you are going to also create a greater contraction in order to contain it.
And that is true for each of the types. That if we try to push our river for each of our types, we're gonna get ourselves into trouble.
Yeah.
And in the podcast, we'll get deeper into some of these conversations. I do want to ask you, before we get too deep down one type or several types, I want to ask you about the modalities that come into play in the more formal idea of the somatic Enneagram. As we go, we'll hear more about it. And certainly, if people are interested, they can sign up for a module or go deeper in some of these teachings. But I would love to talk to you a little bit about just what modalities are coming into play when it comes to things like capacity or understanding what's going on internally or feeling overwhelmed or being aware that when we're trying to push ourselves too much, what is happening. So we mentioned some of them in the intro, but I'd love to hear from you just what all modalities are at work in this somatic Enneagram.
Yeah, so not to kind of revert back to a particular type, but as an 8, I was used to pushing the boundary and wanting to expand and push past. So I learned at a fairly young age, my young 20s, that if I did that, I would get the opposite result. And that was a somatic feeling of heaviness, density, solidity that felt unmovable, that was very, very uncomfortable. And I also was an athlete, so I did a lot of movement stuff. I did yoga at the time, I did meditation. And no matter what I was engaged in as a young age, I would want to make it happen, want to give it the juice that I felt it needed in order for something to happen, not knowing that it was my little ego pushing really hard against boundaries that were lying beyond my capacity. Yeah. And then I learned that I would get what I call an ab reaction. Yeah, an adverse reaction. We call it an ab reaction. And so the abreaction was so frustrating, so exasperating. So I learned by running up against walls and doors, bounce back. That's how an 8 learns. The good news is you learn because you can't get past it. Your instinctual body will not allow it. And thank God that our instinctual body protects us to not go beyond our capacity. Yeah, that's why we survive. It's not because we have done something so special. It is because we are created physically in our neurobiology to instinctually have the protection that matches our inner capacity for whatever it is. So in my young 20s, I was starting to do the yoga. I had a couple of yoga sessions where I felt so deeply relaxed and surrendered into the ground that I felt like I was kind of imprinted in the ground. And I didn't have to hold anything up. And yet I felt so incredibly energetically present and strong and vital and resilient without it being something that is going to propel you into the next motion. It was more working with the field of awareness, of the energy field that I could feel in and around me, that was just resonating all through me. And there was not a thought in my brain that said, I want to get out of here. I want to stay
That's,
here.
yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, you talk about having to learn these things in a really visceral, embodied way. And so many people don't take the lessons that may come, and then they come again and again. And what I'm struck by, again, is that connection to the curiosity and the willingness to seek out teachers and practices and modalities, whether it's yoga or biodynamic work, to let your mind have enough information and then bump into those walls and then allow yourself to surrender. Because especially for an 8, but for any of us, surrendering is the hardest part, even if we seem like we should be learning the lessons. But it sounds like that practical aspect mixed with the spiritual, seeking after truth quality brought you through. And I'm curious, from those experiences, obviously this has been a long journey to get to having this method that you're getting more and more specific about and offering into the world. I'm just curious to hear more about how you got from having some of those experiences to actually getting to this place where you have something that you want to bring forward and that you uniquely are in a position to bring forward.
Yeah, so that was a long road of slow but steady, always seeking, the parts of the healing modalities that would incorporate the spiritual. Like, for instance, after the yoga and macrobiotic, and I changed everything and doing the more heart-based Indian meditation through Krishnamurti, through traveling to Tibetan Buddhism and working with Tibetan Buddhism and the whole concept of the two opposing parts and how to embrace that, and seeing the yogis, that have embodied spirituality. And it's like, what we are being taught in Christianity, that the body is sinful, the body is lower, and it doesn't have any intelligence. And even in the Enneagram world, we see that, that whole bottom center wasn't fleshed out with any kind of reference to, the intelligence that's actually operating in that belly center, that is not separate from spirit at all, right? It's not just the higher heart and the higher head. There is a higher body. And to have all 3 centers experienced that came first and foremost from my own lived experiences. And then working with the craniosacral work, and I did a lot of constellation work, and I did some deep root osteopathic work to really kind of be in situations where you go backwards, fall backwards in a pit of foam, and walk through a marsh, and in the middle of winter dump yourself into the cold water and walk over fire. I did all of it. I mean, in my life I did so much because I was so curious, and I felt something inside of myself that I could not feel and not sense and not know about. And I feel really grateful for that, because that was my North Star that would keep drawing me to the next experience, to where I realized, oh, spirituality is not this high exalted thing. It's an everyday, completely modest thing that is extremely energetically uplifting and grounding and goes beyond space and time. So when I finally met the Enneagram in 2003, it was Peter O'Hanrahan that came to our particular physical therapy center. And how he came to us is that we sent one of our employees to go and do the first part of the training. And she came back from that training transformed. And I said, I don't care what they teach. I need to know something about it, because I could see again the practicality of someone who was one way when they left and was another way, when they came back. And I remember telling her, not knowing I was an aide, that the moment I was behind her looking over her shoulder to, at that point, all the appointments were written, and I was looking over her shoulder, she would jump out of her chair. And it's like, if you want to work here, you need to learn how to hold your seat, because all I am doing is looking at the schedule. Little did I know she would survive. I was an 8, So I got to learn about that in the Enneagram, which was amazing, because so many connections started to happen between the spiritual and the body through the psychological patterning of the modern Enneagram. And it was so enlightening that when I sat in my training in 2005, and that little snow man came with 3 singers, and I see all these words on the top and a little bit more on the heart, and nothing, just referred to as in the circle itself, like instincts and subtypes. And it's like, there is something missing here. And oh my God, at a certain point I said, I have the contraction and the expansion. I already know about this from all my studies, my neurobiological studies. I had already met Peter Levine and studied with him in the living rooms of Berkeley. And when he kind of put the method forward, that's all at that point that I needed. It's like, oh, here it is. This is why people can't go beyond their capacity of what they can transmit in their neurobiological system. And that needs to be honored, that we can only take in as much as the capacity that we currently have.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like as you've come across these different methods and modalities and experientially getting into it, watching other people transform, you have been drawn to certain aspects of those teachings. And then the Enneagram, I mean, for me, what I find to be so powerful, and what I'm hearing you say as well, is, we can have an experience for ourselves, but we often assume that everybody's having that experience, or we assume that it's this global principle. But recognizing how this shows up in a 5 versus an 8, or how this shows up in somebody with a different background and what their bodies experienced, and then having the language. But I agree, so many of the Enneagram spaces that are available, that have been available, are so focused on the language and the label and the one aspect of the mental world or the emotional world. And we don't have a lot of language for the physical and the what's really happening inside. And so I just want to highlight that, because that's what you have been working on since long before the Enneagram. And then like, it sounds like something opened in you of like, okay, this is where this fits. There's a map here that needs something that I have to offer.
Yeah, so besides just the trauma work with Peter Levine, I've also studied with Kathy Kane, who for a long time was one of his hands-on teachers, and I studied for a long time with her and still occasionally drop into her trainings. And she was really teaching energetic ways of working with people and feeling and sensing when the person could receive the touch that was being administered and when it would bounce back at you because whatever it was could not be received. And so that dexterity of understanding how to feel through the layers and work with the placement of attention, to having your hand on the skin, but your attention placed on a particular part, either in their viscera or their, musculoskeletal system or their nervous system. And that wherever you placed your attention, that's where the energy would be transmitted. So I've learned to apply this to the healing and also therefore help people create a capacity in their body that is less defended, less protected, and more receptive by nature. So this is all, interwoven with my ability to work with people in their bodies and at the same time begin to palpate energetic, levels or spiritual assistance. I mean, it's actually an amazing deal once you start to hone in on these things. So you develop intuition by, studying the body to the point of understanding that it cannot be devoid of and is infused with spirit everywhere you go.
Wow. Well, I think this is such a beautiful insight into how you see the energetics and the work and the somatic with the Enneagram and where you've been picking up some of these things. And I wanted to hear from you before we wrap up this first episode. What role do you see the somatic Enneagram work that you've been honing over these last decades? What role do you see it playing on the planet, and why now? Why is it coming forward now? And what's important about that for you at this point in your life and career?
Well, I feel I've been asked to be the precursor of getting to the 100th monkey. Yeah. So the people that are being asked to forge the path and get a lot of resistance on the way until the 100th monkey has, joined. And that has happened now, right? So the people that are leading up to, the work that needs to be prepared in order to get the West to prepare and to open to a collective consciousness of somatics. Yeah, the word somatics, the word trauma, it's news to a lot of people now, but people are open to it because from a 100th monkey philosophical point of view, the field has opened. Yeah, so everybody wants to know about trauma. And it's like, how are we going to work with protecting, the Enneagram to be attached to trauma work? Yeah, because that's not what it is. Trauma work will always be in need of professional training work in trauma resolution work. Yeah, that's why I don't call it trauma. I call it overwhelm, which is the precursor of trauma or potential PTSD. But in normal development, we have to go through overwhelming circumstances, as we have just talked about capacity. If you're little, you don't have a lot of capacity. Your brain isn't even fully developed yet. Yeah. So you have a lot of external protection, and you also have something neurobiologically there to help protect you from harm. So the important thing is that we need to understand that the Enneagram itself is a vehicle to really learn to relax the reactivity of the type structure. And the type structure is a three-centered awareness that we all need to gather about our types and other people's types. It's not just the body. However, the root of the arising of these patterns and the fuel comes from the somatic and the felt sense part and the sensations of your body. And they are always happening in the present moment. Yeah. Even if they come in as an association with a memory from the past, the moment they happen in your body, they're happening now, even though you're not in danger. And that's why it's not congruent with the current aspect of your life. And the patterns, according to the Enneagram, are psychospiritually, but also somatically wired.
Yeah.
And to know what role the somatics plays here is that it provides the fuel, and learning how to be with the understanding of what is arising in you that is doing something for you, not against you, is the first step in learning how to make space for rather than fight against, and therefore compacting down and repressing and, just containing a lot of the overwhelm in your system.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how naturally go into the mechanics of how it's operating. And I know the way you hold this work, like you said, is not so much about trauma. And nowadays everyone's like, oh, I have all this trauma, when what they're often talking about is just the natural process of being a human and not getting all of your needs met and having these compensatory strategies that have worked until you get to a certain place where they become limiting. And what I'm hearing you, when you talk about bringing this piece in, it's about helping people really work through that developmental process of going back to where we got overwhelmed so that we can heal in a way that doesn't overwhelm the body that again. And I don't know much about 100 monkeys, but it feels it feels so pertinent.
Philosophical understanding of how collective consciousness it comes into being, and that's the way they describe it.
And that's what I'm curious. Yeah, it's not like this moment where all of this research and learning and the Enneagram having been expanded upon for a while now, that you're taking the moment that we're in collectively to bring consciousness to this area that is now ripe for exploration. And I'm just curious, as we wrap up this first episode, what do you imagine could be possible if more people understood the somatic Enneagram and the principles that you use to work with it?
Well, if you really integrated the three centers, and especially understand the wisdom and the distortion that may come from past experiences carried through time into the present moment. Yeah. Learning how to safely discharge these energetic constructs that we carry will allow us to have way more capacity for receptivity and to really take people in the way that they are and notice the reaction and choose to place the attention somewhere else so that you don't have to counter it with a reaction. So you're freeing yourself from having to go into an automatic reaction of pain and suffering and then defending it as if your life depends on it. And that creates wars. So the ultimate capacity is to sit around the table with the opposition and begin the conversation. That's difficult. And yet, if we learn how to work with this fueling that you can interrupt, and the pattern begins to soften, and receptivity opens to the world around you, to the people in it, that allows for the conversation, the dialogue to begin and hopefully to complete. Yeah. Rather than staying down there, because it is the least understood center that we have access to, because it is wired to unconsciously operate without our awareness. So it has been doing that for many years and is very entrenched in, how we survived in the first time. We keep repeating because the brain loves success and it likes to repeat what worked before. And therefore it becomes subliminally there operating without you even recognizing it's doing it and that you've gone into overwhelm. Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, and I hear the implications both on an individual level, on the interpersonal level, and then on the collective level of how much suffering is perpetuated when we're not willing to look at these things inside ourselves. So
not willing, not even knowing where to go. Right. Remember how I say something about mapping your inner landscape? That is literally uncharted territory for most of us.
Yeah, we're so distracted.
Outward, 80% outward for sure. And then that little bit 20% goes to what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And that stays split. Yeah. That repeats and it repeats.
Yeah. And I'm so looking forward to getting deeper into tidbits. I mean, this was so rich to set us up with where you're coming from, what you're seeing. And I'm just feeling really moved and excited for the possibilities from my own experience and working with you and seeing people do this work, what becomes available when we're not spending all that energy defending ourselves and wanting that to ripple out. Because I don't think there's anybody who would disagree with the fact that this world is full of people who are in defensive mode and continuing to perpetuate all of the suffering that we are experiencing.
Yeah, it perpetuates the suffering. And to know that there is a safe way to approach these inner conflicts, those inner divides that we carry, and learn how to reconcile these places inside. All of the sudden, you are seeing the world differently, like Helen Palmer would say. If you can relax through the contraction and you're allowing that to move through you, you look again and you look sideways and the world looks different. It's still the same world. It's the same thing you're looking at, but it looks different because you have changed.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Somatic Enneagram podcast. You can learn more about Marion Gilbert, her teachings, and sign up for her training modules by visiting mariongilbert.com or somaticenneagram.com. The Somatic Enneagram podcast co-hosts Karen Burley and Aaron Maines are both trained in the Marion Gilbert method and work with clients in person and online. Head to the show notes to learn more. Help us grow this podcast by subscribing, leaving a review, and please share it with your friends. Until next time.